Hello and welcome to this economics content training video produced by the Georgia Department of Education. In this video, we will review Economics Standard SSEF4, elements A and B that deal with economic systems and how they address the basic economic questions and a variety of other variables. At first glance, this standard and the subsequent elements may look cumbersome, time-consuming, and overly detailed. At its heart, however, this is a very straightforward compare, contrast, analyze standard with some pretty simple content actually. The standard essentially deals with the concept of economic systems. An economic system is, in its most simplistic form, an organized set of rules and policies used to allocate scarce resources. It can be as small as a household or as big as a country. Even your classroom is an economic system. These systems all have productive human, natural, and capital resources to varying degrees. To begin, there are three basic economic questions that any economic system must answer: what to produce, how to produce it, and for whom it should be produced. The way these three questions are answered lets you know what kind of economic system you're dealing with. Traditional economies answer the three basic questions by relying on previous practices, customs, beliefs, or culture. There aren't a lot of examples of completely traditional economies in the modern world outside of Aboriginal tribes and pockets of rural communities around the globe here and there. However, many economies, even large ones like the United States, have elements of traditional practices embedded within. More on that in a moment. Command economies rely on the government to answer the three basic questions. The productive resources are primarily, or totally in a few countries, owned by the government, and the government decides how they will be used and how they will be distributed. A true market economy, in the purest sense of the word, would be the exact opposite of a command economy. All decisions about what, how, and for whom would be decided by producer and consumer interaction only. It's worth noting that there are no purely market economies on a large scale, meaning at the country level. There's not one country you can point to and say that is a purely market economy. Even the freest economies in the world have at least a little government interaction. So, if there are no market economies, no major traditional economies, and very few command economies, what are most economic systems? Well, most economic systems, in fact the vast majority, are a mixture of command, market, and traditional. This means that sometimes economic questions are answered by the government, sometimes by producers and consumers, and sometimes by cultural cues. Let's break down the United States, for example. Most of our goods and services in this country exist in a market-type setting. The prices, quantity, variety, quality, and availability of goods and services is largely dictated by producers and consumers. Everything from donuts to cars, Halloween candy to Hollywood movies is allocated this way. At the same time, there are many things in the United States that the government controls or at least heavily influences. Public education, military protection, interstate highways, courts, and social programs are not really market-based at all. And still, there are elements of traditional economies in the U.S. The day after Thanksgiving is a major day for consumption, for example. Certain goods and services spike in sales around other holidays, and people give each other money on their birthday, etc. Things like that don't have any real government reason, nor are they dictated by the market. We tend to do those things just because they are culturally significant to us in the United States. The degree to which the economy leans towards command, market, or traditional, therefore, has a lot to do with how well they address and use a variety of economic goals. Since this video deals with content, I won't spend a great deal of time on pedagogy, but I would strongly suggest using some degree of a case study to teach this concept. There are so many examples, both historic and modern, that it makes sense when trying to compare all these different variables. The bulk of your time should be spent comparing command to market economies, as traditional economies are very rare. The Heritage Foundation's Index of Economic Freedom is a great resource to teach this content. If you have not used this resource before, please check it out before teaching this topic. You can find it by Google searching Heritage Foundation Index of Economic Freedom. Now, we will take the variables in the order they are presented in the standard and element and take a brief look at how command and market economies differ. Private ownership. To what degree are the people of the country allowed to own assets, including physical, financial, and intellectual property? In market economies, people are allowed a great deal of private ownership. Countries like Hong Kong, the United States, and Canada protect this right with courts that allow people to sue other people or businesses if their ideas have been stolen or their property has been damaged in some way. Command economies do not protect this right because, as in North Korea, for example, the government owns the productive resources and therefore most of the goods and services produced with them. The idea of privately owned goods is rare in these types of countries. Profit motive. To what degree do business owners get to keep and decide how to use profits from their business? In a true market system, your money would be earned through your ability to combine resources to provide goods and services that consumers wanted. Therefore, you would be entitled to keep whatever you earned. Even though in places like Hong Kong and the United States, there are taxes on these profits, you're allowed to keep the balance and do with it, for the most part, what you will. Since there is little to no ownership of businesses in places like North Korea or Cuba, profits are essentially non-existent in the first place. And even if you did come up with a money-making plan, you wouldn't have access to resources to make it happen anyway, so the profit motive is pretty much completely absent. Consumer sovereignty. Sovereignty is similar to power in this case. To what degree do the consumers have power? In Hong Kong and the US, they have immense power. Consumers can decide not to buy items, to buy competing items, to demand safer goods and services, boycott companies, etc. In command economies, this is not the case. The governments are usually not able to fully supply all the goods and services needed in the first place, and since there is no competition, consumers have no alternatives, thus no real power to change anything through demand. Competition. In this case, the standards are referring to businesses being able to compete. It's pretty straightforward here. Market economies allow as much competition as the market can bear in many cases. They often even encourage competition through things like antitrust laws. Command economies purposefully limit that competition to maintain control of the economy and resources. Government regulation. How much does the government try to control private companies? For market economies, this can vary greatly and can even vary from industry to industry. In the United States, for example, your local weekend farmers market is not subject to any real strict government control, while other markets, like the automobile industry, for example, face incredible amounts of oversight and regulation. Command economies, on the other hand, thrive and indeed exist because of government regulation in answering all three questions of what to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce. Therefore, the amount of government regulation is excessively high. Element B of this standard asks students to analyze how well these different economic systems meet some broad social and economic goals like the ones seen here. Quite honestly, this is really more of a country-to-country kind of issue rather than an economic system issue, because there are some cultural, historical, and political variables involved in some of these. In broad strokes, however, we can break things down like this. Market economies are better suited to meet the goals of freedom, growth, efficiency, and sustainability. Why? Remember that market economies allow for more consumer and producer interaction. This interaction serves as a signal to producers as when to produce more of a good or service, when to hire people, when to change prices, etc. And the ability to earn profits and own property encourages entrepreneurs to grow their businesses and look for ways to maintain their business for the long run. These positive traits, however, come with some trade-offs, of course. Everyone is not guaranteed a job. Markets can rise and fall, sometimes unexpectedly, which can have unpredictable effects on prices. Businesses are not required to make sure everyone can afford or get access to their products. People can speculate and borrow money and bet and gamble. These facts make it difficult to always maintain stability, full employment, job and financial security, etc. Command economies are actually better suited to meet these goals. Now, note how I worded that. I did not say command economies actually do meet these goals, but they are at least better set up to meet them. The government, in theory, would make sure everyone is taken care of and the economy was stable, and prices were controlled, and people had the basic necessities. Obviously, the trade-off to this is there was little freedom, no reason to innovate and create new businesses, and design businesses that could last decades or even centuries. It's hard to analyze traditional economies because they are so rare, but in terms of these goals, traditional economies would look a little more like command economies in most cases because they tend to favor stability and security over innovation and risk-taking. On a final note, you'll notice I did not mention the goal of equity. This is because there are two ways of looking at equity, meaning equality here, not value in an investment. The first is equality of opportunity. Everyone gets to start on the same starting line, but where you go from there is up to you. If this is the desirable form of equity a country prefers, they will tend to focus a little more on market-style economic decision-making, with little government regulation. On the other hand, if the goal is equality of results, meaning everyone reaches the finish line in about the same way, for example, everybody has a job, everybody has health care, everybody has a house, everybody has access to government services, then you would need a command approach to balance out the inequities created through a market system. So, while there is a lot of information here, it should be fairly easy for students to organize. The standard is not at any super deep level, and the variables are all pretty straightforward. I have been very broad in this overview, with a few specifics here and there. I highly encourage you, now that you have this background, to do a little research of your own, play around with the Heritage Foundation's website and some other sources, and embellish these stories with your own real-life examples and supporting data that will truly bring this standard to life for the students.